For the past 72 hours, the entire global economy was basically dangling over a cliff. We were hours, literally hours, away from a kinetic regional war. The kind of conflict that, overnight, would have just severed a fifth of the energy that powers the modern world. But then, with under 2 hours on the clock before US bombers were greenlit to strike, someone slammed on the brakes. A 14-day ceasefire. 2 weeks of a very fragile, heavily armed peace. The Strait of Hormuz, the single most vital choke point on the planet, is back open for business. So, we survived the night. But that leaves us staring down one incredibly dangerous question, the only question that matters now. What actually happens on day 15? Let's just cut through the noise. When that 14-day timer hits zero, we aren't getting some historic Nobel Prize-winning peace treaty. But we probably aren't getting World War III either. Instead, on day 15, we are walking straight into a grinder, a prolonged, highly volatile, grey zone Cold War. Because this truce didn't happen because these two sides suddenly want peace. It happened because they are both desperately vulnerable. On one side, the United States accepted this pause because Washington simply cannot absorb the catastrophic inflation and domestic political crisis that a permanently closed Strait of Hormuz would trigger. But on the other side of the chessboard, the isolated regime in Tehran actually needs this ceasefire far more than America does. Despite their aggressive posturing and extreme demands, Iran's domestic economy is teetering on the edge of complete collapse. They simply cannot afford the cost of a prolonged economic and military war against the entire global system. This isn't peace. It's a pause button, slammed down at the absolute last second. To actually understand what this grey zone reality looks like when the clock runs out, we have to look under the hood of this crisis. Today, we are breaking down the absolute madness of the last 24 hours, the brutal macroeconomics of the Strait of Hormuz, and exactly why Tehran's sky-high bluff is about to crash face first into the cold, hard math of authoritarian survival. Let's get into it. To grasp exactly what is coming on day 15, we have to rewind the tape. We have to dissect the absolute madness of the 24 hours right before the pause. This wasn't some standard diplomatic standoff. This was an isolated regime grabbing the global economy by the throat, literally holding the world hostage by sealing off its most critical waterway. The fuse was lit the moment the Trump administration dropped a hard, non-negotiable ultimatum, a strict deadline, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The choice they gave Tehran was brutal and absolutely binary. Either instantly and unconditionally lift the blockade and let global shipping through, or face absolute destruction. No negotiations, no middle ground. The first shockwave didn't hit the battlefield, it hit the trading floors. The second that deadline dropped, global markets absolutely panicked. Energy traders understand the math. You shut down that strait, you trap millions of barrels of oil instantly. You weaponize the entire global supply chain. Brent crude and WTI prices violently spiked. High-frequency algorithms immediately priced in a massive war premium. Asian and European markets opened in a freefall. Because this level of reckless brinkmanship isn't just a military crisis, it is the exact trigger that tips a fragile global economy straight into a recession. That ultimatum started a countdown clock, not just for the bombers, but for the entire macroeconomic system. Yet, what distinguished this crisis from all prior regional conflicts was the sheer, absolute extremity of the political rhetoric. Through a relentless public campaign, the White House escalated verbal hostilities to a historical maximum. The president declared that a failure to meet the 8 p.m. deadline would guarantee the destruction of Iranian civilization. This was not veiled diplomatic signaling. It was an explicit promise to target the arteries of civilian life, power plants and bridges by Tuesday. By using that specific phrasing, the White House essentially bulldozed decades of international norms. The backlash was immediate and severe. Domestically, the statement triggered a legal and political meltdown. Scholars and lawmakers rushed to point out a very dark reality. Treating civilian infrastructure as a military target isn't geopolitical leverage. It is a direct, fundamental violation of the Geneva Conventions. Beyond American borders, The rhetoric sent an immediate shudder through the international community, culminating in a deeply rare intervention from the Vatican. Pope Leo XIV delivered a searing condemnation, declaring that the threat to annihilate a civilization is absolutely unacceptable under any conceivable circumstance. The gravity of this moment cannot be overstated. As the clock bled closer to 8 p.m., the standoff stopped being about angry tweets and ultimatums. It went kinetic. This wasn't an empty bluff anymore. The hardware was actually moving, and the military actions became incredibly, undeniably real. In the shrinking window before the truce took effect, the escalation turned physical. A joint US-Israeli coalition executed preemptive kinetic strikes, zeroing in on Kharg Island. To understand the gravity of this, Kharg is the absolute center of gravity for Iranian crude exports. It is the economic engine of the state. Targeting it was a highly calibrated geopolitical signal, a proof of concept that Washington and Jerusalem were fully prepared to sever the authoritarian regime's financial arteries. Parallel to this, they executed the exact threats made hours earlier, neutralizing strategic bridges and civilian power grids. Cornered by the systematic destruction of its financial lifeline, the regime unleashed a calculated and desperate reprisal. They did not engage the American military symmetrically, a move that would guarantee their absolute annihilation. Instead, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps orchestrated a dramatic widening of the theater of war. They directed their missile forces toward the sovereign infrastructure of Saudi Arabia, executing devastating strikes against the core petrochemical facilities in Jubail. Let's be clear, this wasn't some careful, measured military chess move. This was a cornered animal lashing out. By hitting Saudi oil, Tehran was sending a terrifying, crystal-clear message to the rest of the planet. If we go down, we are taking everyone with us. If their oil burns, they will drag the entire Middle East and the US economy straight to the bottom. They weren't just fighting a war anymore. They were deliberately expanding the blast radius, using a global recession as their ultimate doomsday switch. Real physical infrastructure was literally on fire. The entire global energy market was bracing for a total blackout, held hostage by this absolutely reckless escalation. And right at that exact second, at the absolute peak of the chaos, with less than 90 minutes left on the doomsday clock, everything just stopped. The announcement of a 2-week ceasefire dropped, and it completely shocked the planet. So we just looked over the edge of the cliff. But that leaves us with a massive, multi-trillion-dollar question. Why did the United States, literally the most powerful military machine in human history, hit the brakes? Why agree to a ceasefire with a desperate, isolated regime that is completely cornered? The answer has absolutely nothing to do with military strategy. It's all about a map, a tiny geographic choke point, and the brutal reality of the global economy. If you want to actually understand this crisis, you have to look at the physical map of the Strait of Hormuz. It is an insanely narrow bottleneck. At its absolute tightest point, the actual water lanes where these massive, skyscraper-sized supertankers have to squeeze through, they are only about 2 miles wide in either direction. 2 miles. Yet through that tiny sliver of water flows a fifth of the energy that powers the modern world. We are talking over 20 million barrels of oil every single day, plus a massive chunk of the global natural gas supply. It is, without exaggeration, the single most critical economic jugular vein on planet Earth. To the authoritarian regime in Tehran, this is not just a body of water, it is the ultimate weapon of mass economic disruption. They know that if the strait is actively mined, or if commercial tankers are sinking in those narrow lanes, global shipping insurance premiums skyrocket to prohibitive levels. Commercial traffic halts. Nobody will sail a $100 million vessel carrying $100 million of oil into a free fire zone. At this point, you might be asking a very logical question. The United States is largely energy independent today. The US imports very little oil directly through the Strait of Hormuz. In fact, it is America's geopolitical rivals and Asian manufacturing hubs, like China, that are heavily dependent on this exact route. So why wouldn't Washington just let the strait burn and watch its competitors' economies suffer? The answer exposes the brutal reality of interconnected global markets. Oil is a fungible, globally priced commodity. It doesn't matter if the physical oil consumed in New York or Los Angeles doesn't come from the Persian Gulf. If 20 million barrels suddenly vanish from the global daily supply, the countries that relied on that oil will immediately panic. They will scramble and aggressively bid up the price of oil from every other available source around the world. This massive global bidding war would drag the price of every single barrel of oil on Earth violently upward. US domestic oil prices, like the WTI, would spike in lockstep with global Brent prices, potentially reaching $150 to $200 a barrel within days. Therefore, even without direct reliance on Hormuz shipping lanes, the United States and its Western allies would be crippled by an immediate, catastrophic inflationary shock. The cost of manufacturing, global shipping, and basic consumer goods would explode across the board. At a time when central banks, especially the US Federal Reserve, have spent years battling to stabilize the economy, a sudden energy-driven inflation spike would force them into an impossible choice. They would either have to let inflation run rampant, silently destroying their citizens' purchasing power, or they would be forced to hike interest rates so aggressively that it would plunge the global economy into a severe, deep recession. This is the exact leverage the isolated regime was exploiting. They were holding the global supply chain hostage. Washington realized that completely dismantling Iran's infrastructure, while militarily feasible, would turn the Persian Gulf into a permanent war zone, locking in that global recession. The economic cost of total military victory was simply too high. The two-week truce, negotiated via Pakistan, was not a gesture of diplomatic goodwill. It was a desperate, calculated macroeconomic necessity to keep the arteries of global trade flowing and prevent an immediate market collapse. As the global markets panicked and the military countdown entered its final 90 minutes, traditional diplomacy appeared completely dead. The United Nations was paralyzed, and European allies had virtually zero leverage over either Washington or Tehran. But in the high-stakes world of geopolitics, when the front door is locked and bolted, you immediately look for a back channel. That back channel was Islamabad. The announcement that Pakistan had successfully brokered a 14-day ceasefire shocked many casual observers. But for intelligence and geopolitical analysts, it made perfect sense. Why Pakistan? Why not regional Arab powers or European diplomats? Because Pakistan occupies a unique, hyper-specific node in the global diplomatic network. First, look at the geography. Pakistan is a nuclear-armed Islamic republic, sharing a highly volatile 900-kilometer border with Iran. For Islamabad, a full-scale kinetic war in the Persian Gulf is not a distant economic problem. It is an immediate existential threat. A collapsed Iranian regime would mean millions of refugees pouring across their shared border and total regional destabilization. But more importantly, Pakistan is perhaps the only major player capable of picking up the phone to both sides and actually being taken seriously. The Pakistani military and intelligence apparatus has deep, decades-long historical ties with the United States Pentagon. Simultaneously, Islamabad maintains a complex, pragmatic relationship with Tehran, further stabilized by Pakistan's all-weather strategic partnership with China. In a moment of extreme mistrust, Pakistan was the ultimate credible messenger. They could guarantee to Washington that Iran's offer to pause the blockade was not a stalling tactic, and they could guarantee to Tehran that American bombers would actually stand down if the strait was opened. So what exactly was agreed upon in those final minutes? If we look closely at the official statement from Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi, it becomes terrifyingly clear that this is not a surrender, nor is it a peace treaty. It is a highly conditional 14-day tactical pause.
The agreement explicitly states that commercial vessels can safely resume transit through the Strait of Hormuz. But crucially, it notes that this movement will be coordinated with the Iranian military. This specific phrasing is critical. Domestically, it is a face-saving mechanism for the isolated regime, allowing them to project strength to their internal hardliners by claiming they are still managing the waterway. But strategically, it means the physical infrastructure of the blockade has not been dismantled. It has merely been deactivated.
The naval mines are still in the armories, and the fast attack boats are simply idling at the docks. The gun is still loaded, and Tehran's finger is still resting on the trigger. But here is the crazy part. Literally, as I am writing this script, right at this very moment, the whole thing just flipped again. Israel just launched a massive airstrike on Lebanon, and Iran's response? They immediately slammed the door shut on the Strait of Hormuz. Again, that tiny, fragile window of open transit we just mentioned didn't even last a few days. The sea lanes are shut, ships are making literal U-turns, and the region is back to square one. To predict the outcome, we have to look past the political theatre and analyse the actual underlying leverage. Let's look at the opening bids. When this crisis escalated, the Trump administration's implicit goal was regime collapse. In negotiation terms, Washington wanted to buy a completely broken down car for $50. They wanted to clear the lot. But that quick regime change didn't happen. Instead, it empowered a new, younger, and much more radical leadership in Tehran. Seeing that Washington was politically stuck and desperate to seal that $50 deal, this new government decided to anchor the negotiation absurdly high. What does that look like? Just look at Tehran's recently leaked 10-point proposal. They are demanding the total lifting of all primary and secondary sanctions, the unfreezing of all foreign assets, the complete withdrawal of US forces from the Middle East, and a multi-million-dollar transit fee for every commercial ship crossing the Strait of Hormuz. Any objective analyst can see that half of these demands are completely detached from reality. Washington is never going to withdraw its military footprint just because of a 2-week pause. And paying a transit fee to a sanctioned entity is a political non-starter. In negotiation terms, Tehran is now demanding $50,000 for that exact same broken-down car. We all know the $50,000 asking price is a massive bluff. So why are they acting so aggressive? Because this radical leadership is leveraging a brutal asymmetry of pain. They have accurately identified the Trump administration's Achilles heel: midterm elections and domestic inflation. The authoritarian regime in Tehran has a horrific advantage. They do not care if their own citizens starve. The American government, however, is bound by democratic reality. If the strait stays closed, global oil skyrockets, and US domestic inflation explodes right as American voters head to the polls. Tehran is weaponizing this exact vulnerability. But we must not fall into the illusion that these two sides are negotiating as equals. They are not. Tehran's advantage has a strict mathematical limit. Despite their aggressive $50,000 demand, we must remember the reality. This regime is a cornered beast. Their economy is hanging by a thread. To understand how fragile they truly are, we have to look at the basic math of modern tyranny. In a pure, absolute totalitarian state like North Korea, the military and elite class make up roughly 5% of the total population. That 5% is the baseline. It is the absolute minimum ratio required in modern society to maintain airtight terror control over a population. But in Iran, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps makes up only about 0.2% of the population of 80 million. That means North Korea's control ratio is exactly 25 times higher than that of the Iranian regime. You simply cannot suppress 80 million angry, starving people with only a 0.2% force, unless you have massive amounts of petrodollars to constantly grease the political and military machine. I briefly touch on this here, but if you are interested in the mechanics of this, I actually did a full breakdown in a previous video that you should definitely check out. The core takeaway is this: if the blockade drags on without generating any cash inflow, that 0.2% will be completely overrun. Without oil money, a bankrupt authoritarian regime faces a new, uncontrollable Iranian spring. They are terrified of being overthrown from within. At the end of the day,
a broken car simply cannot fetch a new car price.
Therefore, Tehran needs this deal just as much, if not more, than Washington does. If you try to buy a junk car for $50 and the seller yells 50,000, you usually end up settling somewhere around $300 or $500. What does a $300 deal look like in geopolitics? It is a highly pragmatic, dirty transaction. Tehran will quietly dismantle the physical blockade to lower global oil prices. In exchange, Washington will quietly allow just enough petrodollars to flow back to prevent the immediate collapse of the regime. The grey zone Cold War will continue, but we must realize that time is not on Tehran's side. Once the US gets past the midterm elections, Washington's domestic political constraints will ease. Meanwhile, the Iranian public's tolerance is ticking down day by day. The regime might be using a heavy quilt to smother the fire of domestic unrest, but that fire is still slowly burning underneath. It will eventually burn through. This $300 deal only buys the regime temporary life support. Where exactly will they find the next $300 or $500 to keep their authoritarian machine running when this money dries up? If you want to fully understand the mathematical vulnerability of the regime in Tehran, I highly recommend watching my deep dive video, How 0.2% Elite Rule 80 Million People. You can click the video on your screen right now to see exactly why their control is so fragile. And as always, let me know your thoughts on this 14-day ceasefire in the comments below. If you found value in this analysis, please like and share to support the mission. That concludes the strategy session. To book your seat at the table for the next breakdown, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. Meeting adjourned.